Review of the Chinese in America, a Narrative History. The Chinese in America, a Narrative History is a non-fiction book about the history of Chinese Americans written by Iris Chang. It is the third of her 3 books and the second I have highlighted in this series on the late author. It is listed as an epic and narrative history and published in 2003 by Viking Penguin. The inspiration for Iris Chang to write the book came after she relocated to the San Francisco Bay Area and interviewed or had conversations with numerous key figures in the local Chinese American community. Chang spent 4 years researching and writing after reviewing diaries, memoirs, oral histories, national archives, in addition to those conversations mentioned in the previous paragraph. The book provides an overview of Chinese immigrants into the United States, as well as their descendants, covering several waves of migration, with the first triggered by events such as the California Gold Rush and the Transcontinental Railroad of the 1850s. The second wave was after the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, with the third being after the 1970s and the change in relations between China and the USA. The book looks at the discrimination Chinese people often faced, including the experiences of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the holding of arrivals at Angel Island Immigration Station, and the Wen Ho Lee case. More about those incidents shortly. The book goes into detail about the part Chinese Americans played in activism against oppression, such as the 1867 Chinese labor strike, suing plantation owners who breached agreements, and a protest of the US shipping scrap metal to Japan during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Chang also weaved personal stories into her historical narrative. There were mixed reviews. It was praised for being engaging, well-written and comprehensive, and received additional appreciation for the numerous anecdotes about Chinese Americans. However, critics of the book claim bias and an unbalanced view in repeating how poorly Chinese Americans have been treated throughout history. An audiobook version was released in 2005. Wen Ho Lee. As mentioned in the opening passages, I now highlight the story of Wen Ho Lee, also known as Li Wen Ho, who was born on the 21st of December 1939 and was born on the Chinese island of Taiwan before moving to the United States. After graduating, Wen worked first at the University of California and then at the Los Alamos National Library in New Mexico. His role was to create computerized simulations of nuclear explosions for the purpose of scientific inquiry, in addition to improving the safety and reliability of the US nuclear arsenal. In December 1999, Wen was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of stealing secrets about the US nuclear arsenal for the People's Republic of China. However, federal investigators were unable to prove these allegations, which led to a second investigation. Ultimately, he was charged with the improper handling of restricted data, just one of the 59 charges initially brought against him. He pleaded guilty to that misdemeanor as part of a plea settlement. In a civil suit settled in June 2006, Wen Ho Lee received $1.6 million from the federal government and 5 media organizations that leaked his name to the press before any charges had been filed against him. Federal Judge James A. Parker eventually apologized for denying him bail and his being incarcerated in solitary confinement. This was just one of the stories Iris Chang covered in her book, highlighting the way some Chinese Americans were mistreated. Biological background and publication. Having admitted she was emotionally drained after writing her second book, The Rape of Nanking, Iris Chang claimed that the topic matter for her third book was like a vacation that allowed her to recover from the wounds of her second book. Iris Chang was motivated to begin the book largely due to the American media's propagation of offensive stereotypes about Chinese Americans. Chang described how the Chinese were portrayed as having pigtails, slanted eyes, and buck teeth in movies, and were often portrayed as secret agents or villains. A significant number of her stories were from former students born in China, then having arrived in America to continue their university education, didn't always find the country of their dreams. Most of their goals of the book would help secure or improve the human rights of Chinese Americans, rather than in the two previous books concentrating on particular people and events. Content of the book. The book mainly focuses on Chinese immigrants into the United States and their descendants, with the narrative beginning in China during the Qing dynasty. There is no doubt that the United States experienced several waves of Chinese immigration, with the California gold rush in the 1850s being possibly the first of those waves, swiftly followed by the rush for labor during the construction of the first Transcontinental Railway the next decade. An estimated 100,000 men, and it was mostly men, as they outnumbered the number of Chinese women to make the journey by a ratio of about 12 to 1. These men, mostly from impoverished villages, relocated to the gold fields in search of finding gold. When the gold rush ended, over 50,000 Chinese laborers sought work on the next project, the building of the railways, with over 1,000 of them dying in the rugged terrain and tough winter conditions they had to endure before the Transcontinental Railway was completed in 1869. Once work on the railway stopped, many Chinese laborers dispersed throughout the country, usually offered low-paying jobs such as cooks, grocery store workers, herbalists, laundry workers, and waiters. Over time, Chinatowns were created in cities such as San Francisco and Los Angeles, before others were also created in cities further east. At first, the predominantly white population generally viewed the Chinese Americans as nothing more than curiosities and took little notice of them, but as the numbers of Chinese immigrants increased, the white population became somewhat more hateful, as fears rose that these waves of fresh immigrants would take their jobs. This in turn led to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which for 3/4 of a century barred any new Chinese from entering the country. There were ways around this, including fake papers stating they were born in China to American citizens. The response by the US government was to hold Chinese arrivals at the Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco. Angel Island Immigration Station. Detention at Angel Island was in conditions reminiscent of a jail, which was in operation for just over 30 years, from January the 21st, 1910, until its closure during the Second World War on November the 5th, 1940. Immigrants, particularly Chinese, were detained and interrogated before being allowed to enter the United States. It is estimated around 100,000 Chinese immigrants and tens of thousands of Japanese were processed through this center. The majority of immigrants held at the center were from Asia, predominantly from China, Japan, India, and the Philippines, as well as immigrants from Mexico. It was considered an ideal location as it was easy to control immigrants due to its isolated location, the ability to control outbreaks of disease, and to enforce new immigration laws. Sometimes referred to as the Ellis Island of the West, Angel Island opened in 1910 after a former Coast Miwok village site was leveled, including the interred remains of numerous indigenous people. The main purpose of the center was to monitor the flow of Chinese immigrants entering the USA. After the introduction of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the only Chinese allowed to enter the country were merchants, clergy, diplomats, teachers, students, and barred were laborers. At Ellis Island, only between 1 and 3% of all those that arrived were barred from entering the United States. However, at Angel Island, that figure was much higher, at around 18% being rejected. The Chinese were seen as a threat because they often took the lowest paying jobs. The detention process varied greatly at Ellis Island. The majority of immigrants were processed on the same day and free to enter the United States. However, at Angel Island, the process was very different. For some, it was an experience of just a few days. For others, this process took months, with the longest recorded stay being for 22 months. Exclusion Act rescinded. In 1943, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt rescinded the above act, which enabled Chinese Americans to become naturalized citizens. However, that feeling of goodwill towards Asians was somewhat short-lived after the 1949 defeat of the US-backed nationalists to the communists, swiftly followed by the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. While many of those admitted into the US filled the top universities, and despite their achievements in adapting to American culture, many were unjustly accused of being operatives for their homeland. This came to a head in 1950 when Joseph McCarthy started his campaign to oust out alleged communists from within the US government during the Red Scare. Between 1850 and 1882, there had been an estimated 250,000 Chinese people living in the USA. From 1882 until 1943, when the Exclusion Act was dropped, many found ways into the USA through illegal channels, and after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, numerous Chinese legally entered the USA, with around 100,000 in the 1960s, with other approximately 1 million Chinese immigrants arriving by the turn of the 21st century. In the first quarter of the 21st century, the influx of Chinese immigrants has mostly been of the highly educated, although there remains a percentage of illegal entries working mostly in restaurants and the clothing industries. The final chapter of Iris Chang's book, titled An Uncertain Future, probes the changing dynamics of racial groups and their acceptance in America, and that the relations between Americans and Chinese Americans is often irrespective of how many generations of ancestors Chinese Americans have lived in America. They are still asked, but where do you really come from? Themes of the book. A frequent theme throughout the book is that Chinese Americans have been lauded and then oppressed during their time living in the United States. Iris Chang chronicled how Chinese laborers were praised for their ethic of hard work during railway construction projects, then vilified for taking American riches. During World War II, the Chinese were considered allies, but just a few years later, that approach changed dramatically with the onset of the Korean War, and Chinese Americans were accused of communist espionage. The Chinese were denied suffrage, denied hospital care, and in California, Chinese American children were not permitted to attend public schools. After this practice was contested in the court, San Francisco created separate schools for Chinese children. In 1853, California passed the Criminal Proceeding Act, which included Chinese Americans being barred from testifying in judicial proceedings involving white people in a process known as degraded castes. Conclusion. Critics and reviews of the book were generally praising in the way it was written and telling an important chapter in America's history. One review described it as absorbing, a passionate story of the Chinese-American experience, while another praised the research as exhausting amidst Chang's sheer writing ability, while a third stated it was a valued mirror to the struggles of one ethnic group to win its rightful place alongside others. Not all of the reviews were favourable. Some criticised in their opinion, lack of detail, while others found the stories captivating and well worth reading. Iris Chang's book chronicled major events in Chinese-American relations, such as the Cold War, McCarthyism, and the simplistic policies of Reaganism that were simply not so. There was a comment asking for an assessment as to why Chinese Americans are considered to be outsiders. I think, from my perspective as a white European, that assessment could be considered for all Americans that are not white Caucasians. This could be summed up by Stephen Silvis of the Willamette Week, who called it a powerful book that leaves one breathless at times by the ignorance and barbarity of white American culture and law. That brings us to the end of this video, highlighting a period of Chinese history that through the writing of Iris Chang has helped highlight some of the issues faced by Chinese people living in the USA, both in the past and present. If you've enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.